Hello, guys. The current, for lack of a better word, media takedown of Caitlin Clark has kind of gone past the stage where it's like, okay, this is normal. Because at some point, you have to stop and ask yourself a very simple question. What exactly has Caitlin Clark done to deserve the amount of criticism that's being thrown her way right now? Seriously, think about it. Caitlin Clark has just played what were arguably two of the best defensive games of her professional career. We can sit here and talk about the shooting percentages, the turnovers, the offensive rhythm, all of that stuff. But if we're being honest, her effort level on the defensive end has been outstanding. That's not even really debatable. And yeah, people will point to moments where she got beat defensively. People will point to individual possessions. But let's remember the context. Caitlin Clark was sitting on 5 fouls. She could not afford to foul out of that basketball game. There comes a point where giving up a basket is actually the smarter basketball decision. Because let's be real, 2 points are better than losing Caitlin Clark entirely. The numbers tell the story. The Indiana Fever looked completely different with Caitlin Clark off the floor. The offense practically collapsed whenever she wasn't out there. The offensive rating difference was enormous. With Caitlin Clark on the floor, the team functioned. With Caitlin Clark off the floor, everything slowed down and became difficult. It was really bad, really bad. And that's why I find it strange that so much of the conversation immediately turns toward criticism. Now, that brings us to Stephanie White. A lot of people want to blame Stephanie White for everything that's happening. I don't. I genuinely don't. Do I think Stephanie White is the perfect coach for Caitlin Clark? No. Do I think Stephanie White is the coach that maximizes Caitlin Clark's strengths? Probably not. But that's very different from suggesting there's some kind of personal issue. Because every time I look at the interactions between Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White, I don't see two people who dislike each other. I don't see two people trying to undermine each other. I see two people desperately trying to make something work. And sometimes in sports, that's the hardest thing. Sometimes everybody involved wants it to work, and it still doesn't. That's why I've consistently said that Stephanie White may simply be the wrong coach for Caitlin Clark from a basketball perspective. Not as a person, not as a leader, not as a human being, just as a basketball fit. Because basketball fit matters. The Indiana Fever have a system they want to run. They have an identity they want to establish. And if we're talking purely basketball and removing all emotion from the conversation, there is an argument that the Indiana Fever and Caitlin Clark may simply want different things offensively. That's not necessarily anybody's fault, but it's something that has to be acknowledged. You have players like Kelsey Mitchell who seem comfortable operating within the current structure. Then you have Caitlin Clark, whose greatest strengths often come when she's allowed to push pace, create chaos, and play with freedom. Those aren't always the same thing, and that's where the discussion becomes interesting. What makes the situation even more interesting is the media coverage surrounding it. Because one thing that keeps standing out is that some of the harshest articles written about Caitlin Clark seem to come from people who have connections to the Indiana Fever organization or connections to Amber Cox. Now, does that automatically mean anything? No, but it does make people ask questions, because when the same themes keep appearing over and over again, fans start noticing, and that's why so many people have become suspicious of the timing of certain stories. I keep going back to that moment during the Atlanta Dream game. Caitlin Clark hits a 3, the crowd reacts, the momentum changes, and for a break stretch, Caitlin Clark looks like herself again. You could see the confidence, you could see the energy, you could see the emotion, and then you look over at Stephanie White. Stephanie White is emotional. Stephanie White is visibly emotional watching Caitlin Clark succeed. That's not the reaction of somebody who wants a player gone. That's not the reaction of somebody trying to sabotage someone. That's the reaction of someone who desperately wants things to work. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. You are never going to hear me accuse Stephanie White of sabotage. I don't believe that. I think Stephanie White wants Caitlin Clark to succeed. I think Caitlin Clark wants Stephanie White to succeed. I think both of them are trying. The problem is that trying doesn't always guarantee results, and that's where all of these trade rumors begin to gain momentum. When Complex publishes articles discussing the possibility of Caitlin Clark being traded, people pay attention. At first, most fans laugh it off. Then another article comes out, then another discussion happens, then another rumor starts circulating, and before long, something that originally sounded ridiculous starts feeling possible. Not because anybody has confirmed it, but because people keep talking about it. That's how sports media works. The repetition becomes the story. Now, personally, if Caitlin Clark were ever traded, I don't think she'd know beforehand. I really don't. It would be a Luka Doncic situation. It would be one of those trades that shocks everybody, because Caitlin Clark is an emotional player. Emotion drives so much of what makes her special. She plays with passion, she plays with energy, she wears everything on her sleeve. If a trade were ever going to happen, it would probably happen without much warning. And that's why I think it's interesting watching the reactions of people around her, particularly Stephanie White, because coaches often hear things before players do. That's just reality. And when you see certain emotional reactions, it's hard not to wonder what people know behind the scenes. Again, that's not evidence of anything. It's just something people naturally speculate about. The other thing that's bothered me is the narrative involving Scott Agness. Some of the reporting seemed to imply that Caitlin Clark played a role in Scott Agness losing access or losing credentials. And honestly, I find that narrative difficult to believe. It feels like a massive leap. Because if similar implications were made about Stephanie White, there would probably be immediate pushback from the organization. That's why people have reacted so strongly. It feels unfair. And fairness matters when discussing players, especially players who are under a microscope every single day. The situation also reminds me of Lexi Hull. Remember when Lexi Hull was fighting for her place? Remember when she started making shots and proving herself? Look at how Caitlin Clark reacted. Look at how supportive she was. That's what teammates do. That's what friends do. When somebody you care about gets an opportunity, you celebrate their success. You root for them. You want them to make it. And that's why that emotional reaction from Stephanie White stood out to me, because it felt similar. It felt personal. It felt genuine. It didn't feel like basketball strategy. It felt like relief. It felt like somebody watching another person finally have a breakthrough moment. And that's why I keep saying this feels different, because it does. At the same time, I don't think the locker room is the problem. I really don't. I don't think Caitlin Clark has issues with the players. I don't think Stephanie White has issues with the players. I don't think Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark dislike each other. I think whatever is happening exists above them. I think the front office dynamics are creating a lot of the noise. That's my personal view. Because when I look at the players, I still see professionals trying to win basketball games. What I do see, however, is a growing media narrative, and that's where the Nico Harrison comparison comes into play. When Luka Doncic was traded, there were suddenly all kinds of stories explaining why it happened. Stories criticizing him, stories questioning him, stories reframing the situation. And fans noticed. A lot of fans felt like the groundwork was being laid to justify a controversial decision. That's why some people see similarities here. They're wondering whether the same thing is happening with Caitlin Clark. Again, nobody knows, but people are asking the question. And the more those questions get asked, the louder they become. The reality is that Caitlin Clark remains the biggest star in women's basketball. Whether people like hearing that or not, it's true. She moves ratings, she moves merchandise, she moves attention. She's one of the biggest reasons why so many new fans started watching the WNBA. That's just reality. And yet, the economics are changing. Fans who want Caitlin Clark merchandise now have more options. They can buy products through Nike. They can buy products tied directly to Caitlin Clark. That changes where the money goes. The Indiana Fever don't necessarily benefit the same way they once did. And while I don't think that's the sole reason for anything, it absolutely changes the business conversation, because sports are still a business. They always have been. That's why every rumor gets analyzed. That's why every article gets dissected. That's why every quote becomes a headline. And when Caitlin Clark publicly blames herself after a loss, only for articles to describe her as somebody avoiding accountability, people notice the contradiction because those things don't match. You can't blame yourself publicly and simultaneously be accused of taking no responsibility. That doesn't make sense. And that's where a lot of the frustration comes from, especially when Caitlin Clark wasn't even the worst performing guard in the game. I'm not saying she played great. I'm not saying she was perfect, but she wasn't the reason everything fell apart. Kelsey Mitchell struggled. Other players struggled. The team struggled. It wasn't one person. Basketball is never that simple. And yet, the conversation keeps circling back to Caitlin Clark. Every time. That's why this whole situation feels strange. That's why fans are frustrated. That's why people keep talking about it. Because whether you agree with the criticism or not, it feels like the scrutiny surrounding Caitlin Clark has reached a completely different level. And ultimately, I don't know what happens next. Maybe everything settles down. Maybe Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White figure it out. Maybe the Indiana Fever find consistency. Maybe all these trade rumors disappear. Or maybe they don't. Maybe we're heading toward a future where difficult decisions have to be made. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I don't think the issue is personal. I don't think Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White hate each other. I don't think there's sabotage. I don't think there's some secret war happening inside the locker room. I think there are basketball differences. I think there are organizational questions. And I think there are media narratives that continue to fuel speculation. That's where we are right now. And until the basketball improves, those conversations aren't going away. Because winning solves everything. It always has. And until the Indiana Fever start winning consistently, every article, every rumor, every quote, and every emotional reaction is going to be analyzed under a microscope. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So you guys tell me what you think. Don't forget, like and subscribe.